Hello everyone and welcome to the Global Mapper webinar for the month of May. My name is Heather Poirier, Marketing Manager here at Blue Marble Geographics, and with me today is David McKittrick.
Hello everyone, and thank you for those words of welcome, Heather. Thank you all for joining us today. Today, we're going to take a slightly different tack for our webinar. When we were discussing the topic, a potential topic for this month, one of the recurring themes that came up was the idea that there are a lot of functions in Global Mapper that some of our users may be not familiar with. Certainly when I conduct training classes, that's one of the responses that I get from my training attendees. And I was in Calgary last week, and the feedback that I got from the folks in that class was that there were a lot of tools that the attendees were not aware of. So today we're going to address that. The working title for the presentation today was Hidden Gems in Global Mapper. We decided to change that and present the webinar as a question. So you think you know Global Mapper? My hope and expectation is over the next hour that those of you who use Global Mapper, even those of you who have been using it for quite some time, may encounter some functions, some features, some abilities, some configuration settings that you were not aware of. So hopefully everyone will learn something today. Before we get rolling, as is typical, we have a few housekeeping issues we need to resolve. Heather.
Yes, currently all attendees are in listen-only mode. However, if you would like to ask any questions during the presentation, you can use the questions tool on the GoToWebinar panel on the right of your screen. A Blue Marble product representative will be answering questions as they are submitted, and we'll also address outstanding questions at the end of the presentation.
That's right, and as available, we will also try to address some of those questions verbally as they come in. We'll try to redirect some of those and maybe answer those as they come in. We have at least 2, maybe 3 people sitting on the sidelines answering your questions today. I should also mention that in the event that you're watching the recording of this webinar, and obviously the live questions are no longer going to be available, please feel free to use our email inbox. You'll see geohelp@bluemarblegeo.com right at the bottom of this slide. Use that at any time. Use that for your questions. Also, the forum. I'll give you more information on the Global Mapper forum at the end of today's presentation. But use those avenues, if you like, to ask your questions, and we'll certainly be more than happy to respond and address those issues. Our schedule is easing off just a little bit, Heather. A couple of events coming up, though.
Yeah, that's correct. We're going to be in London at the GeoBusiness convention. We will also be offering training that week on May 30th in London for Global Mapper users. It'll be a 1-day course. For more information, you can go online and check that out. We'll also be at Africa Geo.
Okay, and the training class in London, I'm actually going to be doing that next week. There's still lots of space available in that one. We've got a very good facility there, so the space available. You can still register. You can still sign up for that one if you're in London or anywhere in the southern part of the UK. We'd love to see you there. Also, I think it's worth putting a plug in, Heather, for an event coming up a little bit later down in the in September.
We will be in Calgary and Houston. We have our upcoming Blue Marble User Conference, and we've decided to have it in 2 locations this year. We invite everybody to join us. It'll be a great event. Mike Niles, the creator of Global Mapper, will be at the Houston and possibly the Calgary one as well. For more information on that event, you can visit our website at bluemarblegeo.com/BMUC.
Yeah, this poster pertains specifically to the Calgary conference, which is on Monday, September 8th. Heather, what's the date of the Houston event?
That one will be on October 30th.
So it's with a space between them. If you want to go to both, we'll certainly be glad to see you at both of those events. So BMUC, don't miss it. This is a chance for you to interact directly with product developers, ask questions. We'll certainly have a lot of presentations there from folks who've been using our software. So very excited to be on the road, presenting the Blue Marble story on the road. Okay, let's get back to today and take a look a little bit more about what we're going to be doing. Now, the agenda for this is a very generic agenda, as you will see as we go through the next hour. So we're going to be hitting on virtually every aspect of the software, uncovering some of those hidden gems, as I mentioned before. We'll begin the process by looking at some of the basic interface functions. Maybe this is more directed to folks who are new to Global Mapper, who have not used it before. Some of the configuration settings you can apply, some of those hidden settings you can set for your version of the software. So I've described this one as interface or general functions. We will then get into looking specifically at some of the digitizing functions, some of the drawing tools. Now, those of you who have been using Global Mapper will be familiar with the digitizer toolbar and the fact that you can simply click on a button to generate an area feature or drop some points on the map. I'm going to show you some of the more hidden components of the digitizer, some of the more interesting and probably more advanced functions for digitizing or drawing features on the map. We'll spend a little bit of time looking at attribute management. I know was it last month, the month before, I can't remember, we did a webinar on attribute management, and we'll revisit some of those scenarios. Specifically, we'll talk about joining attributes and calculating attributes. Maybe not immediately apparent to those of you who are fairly new to the software, but a nice and very powerful attribute management tool. We will look at some of the analysis functions within the software, some of the more advanced tools. 3D viewing will be part of the scenario as well. We'll take a look at some of the configuration options that you can apply within the 3D window. So as you can see, it kind of covers the range of functionality within the software. So let's begin with looking at some of those interface components. I'm going to change my screen right now to bring up a view of Global Mapper, and it's a view I'm sure most of you who are familiar with. This is the introductory screen. One of the buttons that we added fairly recently to the interface was the option to load some sample data. This sample data is actually a world map. We decided that rather than giving you a blank screen, we'd give you an opportunity or an option to load up some sample data. And if I click the button, as you can see, it loads a world map. It gives you a visual reference. And we've got some labels on here. We could disable those labels if necessary. So that's a function which is standard. It's in the product. It's been in there for a few generations. I want to take that away because what I want to show you is the ability to customize that sample data. Now, we provide a world map, assuming that is at least for everyone a good visual reference, but you can put your own file in there. In other words, if you work exclusively within one region and you want to automatically initiate the setup to trigger a standard base map that's more relevant to your area, you can change that load sample data file, and I'm going to show you how to do that. I'm actually going to change to a Windows Explorer window, and I've already opened up the folder location. Right in my computer, right on my C drive where my software was installed, there's a Global Mapper 15 underscore 64-bit folder, which is all of the necessary files to run the software, and you will notice in there a sample data folder. The sample data that we have in here is called countries.zip. I want to take that out of that folder. I'm going to do that simply by cutting that file. I'm going to open up another window. I'm just going to paste that in. I don't want to get rid of it because I'll put it back again later. I'm just going to paste it into another location. And I'm going to take a local file. Now, we are in the state of Maine here. Our company's in Maine. So I want to change my sample data to be a local file. Actually, let me cancel that. I'm going to copy this instead of cut it. Let's copy that file, and I'll paste that right into this folder. And again, any of the supported data formats that can be loaded into Global Mapper can be essentially copied into this folder, the sample data folder. Global Mapper has been configured so that when you click on this button, let me close my Overlay Control Center. So when you click on this button, it will automatically load whatever file it sees in there. So my sample data is now a map of Maine. You can customize it. You can put more than one file if necessary. You can basically generate your own simple entry point. That is the proverbial easy button. How do I get my data into Global Mapper is one of the questions we've asked repeatedly. Simply customize that sample data, and you can have the software behave whatever way you want as far as loading initial data is concerned. So I'm going to continue. Another little trick another function actually we've added fairly recently from the View menu is the ability to display info tips. Info tips are hovering text box, essentially, that describe what's at the cursor location. Now, it doesn't matter what function you've enabled with the cursor. It doesn't matter which tool you have active. You can simply enable that function, and when you move your cursor over a particular feature, in this case, one of my towns, it displays the label. I have configured this to show the label of these towns. I'm going to zoom in just a little closer so we can see this more closely. You can see that that particular town is Milo. Right to the north is a town called Brownville. Now, many of you may be previous webinars. What I'll show you today is the ability to actually customize the text string that is displayed here. You can have fun with this. Once again in the view menu, you'll see right underneath the option to enable info tips, you'll see the option to configure those info tips. And there's a dialog box here that lets you apply certain settings to how those info tips are represented. I'm going to jump straight to the bottom where I want to define a custom attribute string by clicking the setup option. Now, right now, the text that's being displayed when I hover my cursor over a feature is simply the value that's in an attribute called town. In other words, town happens to be the attribute field name in the file that I imported. So it's displaying that automatically. We saw Milo, we saw Brownfield, I think it was the other one. But you can customize this text string. And I'm going to do that by simply putting a piece of text in here. I'm going to type in this town is called. And just as an example to see how this will work. Every text string that appears will be preceded with the text that I've typed in here. This town is called, and then it will pull in the name that's associated with the feature that my cursor is at the position of my cursor. So we'll click OK on that, and we'll click OK on this, and you can see the results of that. This town is called Atkinson. It's a little more user-friendly. This town is called Milo, and this town is called Williamsburg Township. So you can configure and customize those info tips to be much more meaningful in a way. So somebody who's coming to maybe looking at your data can very easily see what the information is. I know there are some folks that I've talked with use this a lot for point data, specifically well data, oil well data. They hover the cursor over an oil well and they immediately see some of the information, some of the relevant information about that oil well. So that's a kind of a hidden function, but one that I think is very useful in certain situations. Now I have to say that in most cases I would probably not have this function enabled permanently, and it's very easy to turn it off. From the view menu, simply uncheck the Enable Info Tips checkbox, and it will no longer appear. I'm no longer going to be displaying that text. Continuing with my loaded data, let me hit the Home button, which brings me to the full extent. One of the tools that I really to go to my training classes is a file management tool that I describe as a spatial bookmarking tool. Let's say anybody who is familiar with the state of Maine may be familiar with this particular park. This is where Acadia National Park is. Let's pretend I'm doing a project in the park, and I want to focus on this particular area. There's a few things I could do to preserve my current view. I could save a workspace. We all, those of us who have used Global Mapper for a while will be familiar with the idea of saving space. I could also save, again, what I describe as a spatial bookmark. From the View menu towards the bottom, there are several options that allow me to save the current view. Now you'll notice a couple that are attributed with as keyboard shortcuts, Alt-R and Control-R. Save the current view and restore the last saved view. Now these are temporary. So if I simply wanted to put a finger in my book, if you like, rather than putting a bookmark, put a finger in, skip to the end to see how the story finished, and then go back to where I was, that's similar to this type of application where you're not really permanently recording it, you're simply temporarily remembering where you were so you can go back after previewing some other location. Moderately useful in my opinion. What's much more useful is save a current view. Now I'm going to select this option and I'm going to be prompted to give it a name. I'm just going to call it Acadia. And I'll click OK. Now, the next dialog box asks me if I want to save this universally across all of my workspaces or just for the current workspace. And I'm just going to save this in my current workspace, which is this button. So that means that that location has been saved. I've placed a bookmark at this location. I could then zoom to another location, and I could do the same. I could create multiple bookmarks that allow me to very quickly go to locations. Perhaps these are project sites, job. I don't have to create different workspaces for each one. I can create bookmarks within a single workspace. From the View menu, Restore, whichever of those named views I want, and then simply click OK. It's a spatial bookmark. There are no keyboard shortcuts assigned to each of those, as you will see, but you can assign them. You can If this is a function you will use repeatedly, I certainly would recommend that. And we'll talk about keyboard shortcuts in a different context a little bit later. Of this loaded data. Another function which may be hidden to some of you, I'm going to open up the configuration dialog box to access this function, is the ability to display a latitude and longitude or a native projection grid on the map. Global Mapper does not display a grid by default. If you load in some data or if you begin the digitizing process, you will not by default see a grid. However, right in the configuration dialog box under the General tab, you will see the first item to display a lat-long grid. I'm just going to enable a lat-long grid as opposed to a local projection grid. I'm going to keep the dialog box open and I'm going to click the Apply button. And you will see that now represented on the screen. By default, Global Mapper will configure the spacing and will configure the display characteristics of the grid using the default settings. But you can change that. You can customize the grid spacing if you choose, if you want a more advanced type of grid. You can extend the grid beyond the loaded data, which is enabled by default. This will truncate or cut my grid off right at the edge of my data. Typically, you'll want to extend it just a little bit. Obviously, you'll want to append units if you're using a projected grid. You'll want to know what those units of measure are, meters or feet. So you'll want to keep those on. So there are certain configurations that can be applied. Also, the default appearance of these grids is, as you can see, these gray lines. The major grid lines are bolder. You can see they're a bolder gray line. You can change the appearance of the grids. These are line styles, and as with every other line style in the software, you can change it, you can customize it. And I'm not going to do that, but just going to show you where you would go to change that style. Again, in the configuration dialog box, looking at the line styles tab, if I scroll towards the top, under my G's, you will see grid line, major, grid line, minor, and we have just the current setting. So you can change this appearance, the style of your grid line to be whatever you want, whatever color, whatever line style you want. So grid display is an option, but it is certainly something you can enable and you can customize and have it display in whatever way you want. I'm going to go back in the interest of keeping my map clean and turn my grid off again. For certain layers, you may encounter a situation where there's a useful zoom level threshold. In other words, a layer becomes relevant at a particular level. That's mostly true, or very often true, with raster layers, where the closer you get in, the further you zoom in, the more pixelated the layer becomes, and truthfully becomes less useful. Similarly, when you zoom out, that layer ceases to become discern, or you can't see the details in that layer. So the tool I'm about to show you allows you to establish a threshold within which a selected layer is visible. And that function is triggered from the Overlay Control Center. Overlay Control Center, for those of you new to Global Mapper, is a tool that allows you to manage your layers, close layers, open layers, etc. In the Overlay Control Center, the option to limit the zoom level extent is a right-click option. And we're going to come back into this menu, by the way, and introduce you to some other functions right within this menu. For now, what I want to do is select specifically to set up the zoom level to display the selected layer at. And I can do this in a few ways. The easiest way is to take a look at the bottom of the screen and note the scale that pertains to the current view, and either establish a threshold above and below that scale based on your requirements, or simply define the visibility of that below a certain scale. Again, for raster data, where it's find the zoom level range below a specific scale. So in this case, I'm just simply going to display an arbitrary range from, I'm looking at my scale now, and it's about 3 million, 1 to 3 million. So I want to see this layer from 1 to 2 million. I just want to type in my 6 zeros, to 1 to 4 million. Now for the main towns layer, if I zoom out and zoom in, you'll see that it disappears when it gets beyond those zoom level thresholds. I've kind of created a very finite zoom level range. But you can now define zoom level range for a specific layer so a layer will disappear. There are many, many, many applications for this. You want to generate contours of a particular contour interval. Maybe you do not need those to appear until you get close. You can define that zoom level range for those high resolution contours. Another example, as we'll see, hopefully we'll get to a chance to show you a labeling function where your labels will only pop in when you get close into a particular layer. So those are a couple of examples where that particular tool can be used. Let me go back in and revert back to the original setting again so we don't and I'm going to always do this if in view. So we've reverted the setting back to its default again. Another function, while we have our Overlay Control Center open, a useful one, I'm actually going to use the Feature Info tool very quickly first. Feature Info tool is a tool that lets you see the attributes for a selected feature. I'm going to choose a town, and you'll see the information that we have pertaining to that town, which is typical of what we would see for all of those towns. One of the variables here is the DOT region, which is a regional designation for the Department of Transportation. I believe there are 5 regions in the state of Maine. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to divide this layer up into individual sublayers, if you like, based on that variable. And it's a very simple process, again, triggered from on the right-click in the Overlay Control Center. I'm going to split into separate layers based on a selected description or attribute value. And as we previewed, the value that I'm going to choose in this case is my DOT region. I simply click OK. And what you'll see in the Overlay Control Center is the same name for the layer at the highest level, but a little plus sign right next to it. And if I click on the plus sign, it now shows me each of the individual DOT regions, and the features that pertain to those regions can now be individually managed. I can turn them all off selectively, I can turn them individually. So I now have the power to address each of these components of my data as a self-contained entity. I've isolated each one. This is also very useful for working with CAD files, where your CAD file will come in as one single entity. If you're working with but you can then very easily divide it up into its component parts by using that function, by essentially creating a tree view, if you like. Now, Global Mapper, as you can see at the level, still allows you to manage this as a single entity, turn it off, turn it on, but you now have the ability to, as I said before, to individually manage sub. Now, the final thing I'm going to show you by way of kind of the introductory section, interface in general, I think is what I described it as, is the ability to essentially display an overview map. This is a new function that was added with the introduction of version 15, and it was added in a slightly different way. We've introduced the ability to add extensions to Global Mapper, and these extensions are activated from right within the Help menu. We have a Module Extension License Manager. It brings up a dialog box. Over on the right side of this dialog box, you'll notice we actually provide a couple of extensions to you at no cost. Going forward, the opportunity is there for software developers to add extensions to this list to essentially enhance the functionality of Global Mapper by building your own tools, essentially, that can be added to this list. A couple in here just as examples. The one I'm going to show you now is an overview extension. Very simple little tool, very useful little tool. You simply check the box and click OK. And by doing so, you'll notice a new button has been added to my toolbar. And that button, as the name implies, provides me the ability, let me close the window, provides me the ability to display an overview of my current layer. Now, currently, the overview is obviously reflecting the full extent of my data, so it looks exactly the same as the map on screen. Becomes useful as I zoom in. So if I'm working in a particular part of the state, I can still see my full extent. I can still see the extent of my data, any loaded data, and click on the map to relocate my map to another location. It's then scaled based on your requirements or based on the availability of your screen. In fact, if you had a dual monitor setup, you can pull the overview map to a second screen and use that for high-level navigation to move around whatever data set you're working in very quickly, very efficiently. And again, it's a toggle button in the toolbar. I would suggest, those of you using Global Mapper 15, go ahead and enable this. It's a free tool enhancing the functionality. If you don't need it, you simply toggle it off. The toolbar button can stay on the toolbar, and you can toggle it on when needed. Hey, Heather.
Hey, are we ready for some questions, maybe?
Oh, okay, sure. Fire away.
We had a question regarding splitting layers. If we want to export a layer, does each layer export separately?
Okay, no, actually, I should clarify, no. Global Mapper's behavior, this is kind of a default rule and worthwhile remembering. Global Mapper's default behavior when it comes to exporting is to export everything that it sees. In other words, right now on the map, although I've divided these up internally within Global Mapper, if I was back to shapefile or to any other vector format, I would get in the file that I exported a combination. In other words, it would automatically merge these back together again. There's a couple of approaches actually. If shapefile specifically, I'll show you an example. You can simply uncheck what you don't need. If I run through an export process right now, that's all that will be exported. Regardless of what displays in the control center, what's shown on the screen is you deselect what you don't need, then run through the export process. Now, specific to shapefiles, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on exporting, but specific to shapefiles, you can actually perform the same splitting function when you export a shapefile. So you don't have to actually do this internally within Global Mapper. If you're simply exporting a shapefile, there is an option to split during the export process, again, based on variables within an attribute. So I guess the answer to the question is no, you will not export separate layers. Keep those questions coming in, folks.
We do have another grid displayed, the grid, the coordinate to the bottom right-hand corner displayed upside down, and a question was asked whether those coordinates could be rotated or edited.
It would take some workaround. Basically, the display of the coordinate values here is determined by the behavior of that line feature. So it's like any other line, or labeling a line. There's a predetermined location where those coordinate values would be displayed. So I'm thinking, I don't recall seeing one of the labels upside down, but I'm thinking that it's just basically going to be determined by type, which we saw in the configuration dialog box, that line style. If you need to just change that line style or that behavior, go into that particular line style, choose your grid line as we did previously, and you'll see you've got complete control over the bottom in terms of labeling and where the labels display and how labels are represented.
Great. I see you can select font and all of that.
Absolutely, font, and this font dialog box actually gives you a lot more options. You can do rotation, position relative to feature, things like that can be determined in here as well. So there's a little bit of flexibility in that regard, but we try to make the grid representation process to be as automated as possible. I'm not sure why my label would have been upside down, but certainly that's not the way it's been designed.
No, it looks like you answered that question,
Okay.
so thank you for that.
Well, as I said, keep those questions coming in, and we'll try to address them either through the questions panel, as we showed you before, or we'll address some of those during the presentation as needed. So let me go ahead and turn my grid off again in the interest of keeping my map a little cleaner. I mentioned keyboard shortcuts before, the ability to assign them. We've mentioned this a lot in different contexts in different webinars that we performed. I'm going to bring this up very quickly here because it is a very simple process. From the favorites menu in the toolbar, you will see the option right at the bottom to set up your own keyboard shortcuts. Now, there's one that pops up. As you can see, there's a commands to which a keyboard shortcut can be assigned, and I'm going to scroll down to one that's used very commonly, and that's the edit function. This is the digitizer edit tool. So if you want to edit a vector feature, and essentially using this function a lot. Currently you can get there by right-clicking, And if that gets a little old, you can certainly assign a keyboard shortcut, and I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to assign the F2 key as my keyboard shortcut, and I'll update that particular example. It'll give me a confirmation that that has been assigned, and we're good. I can simply use my digitizer to select a feature. You can't see what I'm doing right now. I'm hitting the F2 button to bring up the modify feature info dialog box. So it's a very quick and easy way for me to get to that editing capability without having to go to the right-click menu and figure out where it is in the right-click menu. So that's an example of a keyboard shortcut. Needless to say, there are limitless possibilities as far as how you can configure your own version of the software is concerned. Okay, let's keep rolling here. I'm going to unload this layer. Control U, by the way, is the keyboard shortcut. That's another little hidden gem in Global Mapper. Control U will basically remove any and all loaded data. Maybe in the real world it's not something you would do that often, but in my world where I'm doing demonstrations, it's extremely useful. Control U is that one. I'm going to bring in another workspace. Let me go ahead and go to my Load Workspace dialog box. We're going to talk a little bit about the digitizer. The first example of a digitizer function I'm going to show you is something I'm going to assume that most of you have never encountered or never used. This is a tool that was not really designed for the purpose for which I'm going to show you, but it certainly works remarkably well for this particular situation. Now, here we have a situation where, let's assume I'm doing some digitizing work, and these happen to be the same town boundaries we were working on before. I have a feature that I need to digitize to encompass the closed area. Now, in the interests of the integrity of my data, I would want to make sure that every vertex is duplicated. In other words, I don't want any gaps, nor do I want any overlaps. So the digitizing process, while we do have a snapping tool, would still be a very, very laborious process if I was trying to digitize the white area, if you like, this missing feature. It would be a very laborious, very quick and easy shortcut that will allow me to do just that. First thing I'm going to do is grab my new area tool, because I am drawing an area, but instead of trying to match the constraint that overlaps the extent of the area created previously called towns. We'll click OK. So this particular feature type is semi-transparent, so you can see the situation where there's an overlap, a slightly darker color. So again, my goal here is to essentially take the feature I've just digitized and limit it to the extent of the area in the middle. And I'm going to do that first by using my digitizer in its select mode, basically toggle off the area tool I just used, and I'm going to simply select all of these bounding towns, because the feature that we're going to use is essentially the feature for cutting holes or cutting islands in existing. Now, you have to use your imagination a little bit as to how this is going to work, because essentially it's reversed from what it would normally be used for. But to initiate that function, I'm going to right-click now. I'm going to go to my crop combine split functions, and I'm going to pause briefly. I'm going to cut a selected area from another area. Now, again, typically this tool is used to create a hole in a polygon, or a hole in an area feature, like a donut, if you like. So I would be cutting out the area. But in this case, the hole I'm going to be cutting is actually going to be cut by the bounding areas, which is going to be inverted. So it's going to leave what's in the middle. So I'll bring up this function, and the next choice I have to make is, okay, you've selected the cookie cutter, if you like. What do you want to cut from? Now, again, typically this would be the outer polygon, but in my case, I want to cut from the feature I've digitized. So the parent in this case is the polygon in the middle. And asking me if I want to delete those features, I'm going to select no. And the end result of that process is a clean, perfectly matched polygon sitting right in the center of that area. Every vertex has been matched here during that process. Now, in this case, I did it in the middle of several bounding polygons. You could also do it in a single abutment, a polygon that overlaps its neighbor, to ensure, again, consistency in terms of coverage. No overlap, no gaps in my data. Very, very simple, very quick, very easy process to initiate. While I have this layer still on my screen, to generate a centroid point at the middle of every area. To initiate this process, I need first to The preferred method, at least as far as I'm concerned, is the ability to right-click and to select all of the features in a given layer with the digitizer tool. This is particularly useful if your intention is to select just features from a specific layer, because if I use that drag to select, what to do. This ensures that every, by the way, I believe the crop area is not there, so I wouldn't be getting that anyway. So here's these area features selected. I can now right-click once again, and by the way, you will have noticed with the digitizer, there's many functions that are activated or selected from the right-click menu. Certainly, we put the common ones in the toolbar, but there's many more functions available in this right-click menu and the sub-menus that you'll see in here as well. Now, because in this case I have previously selected a number of areas, I have several options that I can apply to these selected features, making modifications, moving, changing them in certain ways. Options, you'll see a number of options in here, including the ability to create centroids at the middle of basically the geometric centroid of each area feature. This is going to create a new layer for me. You'll notice the option I can either move a centroid if it's outside immediately, which I will want to do, and I also have the option to create a centroid point for grouped. The second of those two options is important because geometrically the center of an area, especially if it's like a crescent shape, may physically be outside the area, so we will want to make sure those are moved inside. And we'll simply click OK. Now, as you'll see, I'm going to proceed with this particular scenario by showing you that you can use this function as a label management tool. I'm going to assign a label to each of these points that I've just created. And I want to do that right here in the Overlay Control Center. I should probably have named this layer labels. That would have been a more logical naming sequence. But these new features that I've created, I'm going to call this layer, I'm going to assign labels to the points in this layer. I'm going to do that in the options area for that selected layer. I'm just going to choose one of my attributes to be my label, which in this case is the attribute called town. I'm just going to click OK and select yes, and you'll see now that I now have labels associated with those points. Now, in this particular scenario, I don't actually need the points. I don't need the points to be displayed, in other words. I just need the text. So I'm going to change the feature type for all of these points, and that's going to be initiated by the editing function that I hitting the F2 key on my keyboard, and all of those selected points I can now universally edit, changing the feature type from an unknown point to text. And I'll simply click OK again. Notice I have text, and that text is associated with the point. So I was able to create a layer that now simply exists for the ability to assign labels. It can be independently turned on or off. And what's more important, I can individually move text around as needed. I'm not going to go into the details, but if a piece of text is not where I want it to be, or if a label is not where I want it to be, I can move it to a new location because I'm simply adding a point feature. So the labels were generated from the areas, but I now can independently manage them. I can also limit the zoom level range just as I did previously. In other words, my labels would not appear until I'm close in. So that's a little trick using that centroid tool. And a more efficient way of managing labels. Tools with the digitizer features, area features. I'm just going to select a group of features very quickly here. We want a combination of these. We want to combine them together. It's a very As I introduced you previously, the right-click menu holds a lot of options that can be assigned to selected features. The one I'm going to show you right now is under the crop combine split function, where I combine selected area features. And I can do that process based on matching a selected attribute if that's appropriate. In my case, I'm not really concerned. I'm just going to combine all of them regardless of their attributes. I'm going to click OK. And you'll see now I have a single feature. As opposed to multiple features. So very simple, very easy way to collectively manage multiple features in a single entity. Perhaps one my favorite tools in the software. I'm going to unload this data. And we'll misery. To ensure the integrity of my angles or whatever they happen to be. I have a couple of options in the toolbar for enforcing that rule, to enforcing that right angles will only be drawn or line and area features will be aligned north-south. Those are two options you can trigger in the digitizer toolbar. What I'm about to show you is a tool that's actually, in my opinion, a lot more useful for this type of application. It's not initially visible in the toolbar. You have to access this through right-clicking, and from the right-click menu, under our Create Area features, we have repeated line items that match the toolbar in terms of creating areas, range rings, etc. I'm going to scroll towards the bottom and select my rotated rectangle, a 3-point draw rectangle area. Go ahead and select that tool. Now, I'm going to be creating an area, but I'm going to be creating an area in a slightly different way. I'm going to use this building as an example. I want to outline this building. I'm going to use 3 clicks to do this. My first click is the starting point, and you'll see right now I've got a line feature being created, or it looks like a line feature. I'm going to click again with my left mouse button at the opposite corner. My third click is essentially defining time. Area feature we know is precise in terms of its angles. We know the length of each of these end segments is the same as is the width, so you can ensure the geometric integrity and consistency of your data if you're drawing rectangular features. Very, very simple. We could rotate that if necessary now to ensure it's aligned properly, but that's a very, very easy way. I'm not going to continue with the process of assigning this to a particular layer, but that 3-point click digitizing function, very, very useful. While we're in that right-click menu, one of the tools we often get asked about, is not immediately apparent, is the ability to create circles. There is a circular elliptical area. There's actually 2 ways in Global Mapper of creating circles. One is simple. But you can define more precisely the radius. You can also define the shape of an ellipse. If you want a major and minor axis to be offset, you can define what those major and minor axis dimensions are. So creating a very precise ellipse if you need. So again, not going to go through with that, but just introducing circular objects that you have available.
So David, if a customer wants to combine several areas, what layer does that combined feature get added to, and can I move it around to a specific layer afterward?
I wish that question had come in while I still had the layer up. The answer to the question is it puts the feature that you create in the same layer. So in other words, when I combined those 5 town polygons, what happened technically was it created a new feature in that layer. The original towns were rendered black again, but that new feature was in its own layer. Was in the assume that this is a combined area. If you need to move this to a new layer, there's actually a couple of ways to do that. The first way is using the digitizer. Select it. I'm going to use the F2 to bring up the edit dialog box, and one of the options in the edit dialog box is to decide which layer that feature resides in. This is a moving function. It will move the feature from one layer to another layer. It will not copy it. In other words, it will move it from whatever layer it's in by default into whatever you select here. So that is one option. The other option is a lot more straightforward, and one we're probably all familiar with in other applications. Again, V copies that feature to my clipboard. Control V will allow me to paste it. And I can paste it into the original layer if possible. I can also paste it to a new layer or to options for moving a feature. Again, to answer the question, the feature is in the same layer as the original, but very easy to move that to its own layer if necessary.
Great, thanks for that.
Okay. So, one that we've had a lot of internal discussions about this particular tool and how this tool should evolve. For illustration, it is a creation tool, so you'll go to create point text features, and right at the bottom is a link to the quick point creator, which is actually a little dialog box. This dialog box allows you to create your own library of point features repeatedly or in a recurring way. So if you are in the oil and gas business and you put particular icons to drop some of these points on the map, they're always going to be select them from a menu. I can simply drop them very easily on the map. Now, if I do, even in its own form, own individual point styles by going to the setup dialog box, choosing from the existing points that are in there. You'll see we can filter these as well. There's filtering lists as well. We can essentially limit the points just to what you would typically use in your situation. Quick point creator. I'm just glancing. Sure, we're going to cover everything. Let's take a look at attribute management. I did promise I would show you this, and I know our time is getting short here. So and I'm going to bring up another workspace, which has the state of Texas. Now, attribute management. Again, if you want details on attribute management, there was a webinar a few months ago on managing attributes and how you add attributes and modify attributes, etc. What I'm going to show you is one very specific example of managing attributes, and that's through a joining process. Right now, the attributes for this layer, if I go ahead and use my feature info tool, oops, try that one more time, include the name, population, etc. I'm going to join, and I'm going to select the data within which there is a joining component that matches one of the attributes. I'll very quickly go through this and show you the end results of this process. And again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to spend details going through each individual. And again, using my feature info tool, a new attribute. The Texas oil production data, which was in a tabular file, is now associated with each geometric object on the map. We can also, as an attribute management tool, calculate attributes. And again, I'm not going to do this in this. I was hoping to have time to do this today, but if you want to see this process, revisit the attribute management webinar, and you'll see them in more detail, and certainly will take more time there. But one of the things I want to show you in this calculate attribute dialog box is the ability not only to derive new attributes by applying a calculation, but you can also append and prepend text to an existing attribute, or you can copy attributes and merge them together. Essentially, we could take one attribute, append it as text a different attribute, and merge them together. So as well as using this function for numeric calculation, you can use the attribute calculation setup to merge attributes, to copy attributes, or to append or prepend a piece of text, if you like. So very, very powerful tool. We have, again, demonstrated this in the past based on numeric variables, but there are many, many other options here. Calculating in the broader context can simply mean, taking one piece of text from one attribute, merging it with another, and combining them into a single attribute. So, again, don't have time, unfortunately, today to show you those details, but a very, very useful, very powerful function. Onload the state of Texas. I know this was something I wanted to do a little earlier, but I mentioned that we have a quiz. We usually conduct polls in our webinars, asking you questions about how you use the software, which version you're using. I'm going to change that slightly today. Instead of asking a question that requires your opinion, we're going to quiz you. We're going to initiate a question. I'm going to keep this up for a very short period of time. The question, as you will see, is where in Global Mapper, which menu would you go to activate or to initiate the process of geocoding? So let me go ahead and select the poll. And you're going to see 5 options. I'm going to give you literally 5 seconds to respond to this question, so you can't cheat and go find the software and find it. So you got 5 seconds to respond. We'll see how many of you, what percentage of you get this question right. So which of the listed menus would you go to initiate the geocoding process? You should be seeing the poll on your screen right now. Okay, we've got 3 different options coming in. Somebody choosing edit. And 3, 2, 1, and we will close the poll. Okay. Interesting. Let's bring up the results. And you'll see, hopefully on your screen, you're seeing the fact that most of you think this is under the Tools menu, quite a few under the Analysis menu. Nobody thought it was under File. Well, that's correct. It's not under the File menu. Geocoding is actually under the Search menu. So who got that one right, give yourself a pat on the back. We are now going to show you the geocoding tool, a very, very simple tool within Global Mapper, which, as you correctly, those 11% of you correctly answered, is in the search menu. From the search menu in Global Mapper, there's an option, even without any loaded data, to find an address. Geocoding is a process whereby we find addresses and we assign them a latitude and longitude value. And this can be done in a couple of ways. It can be done either using a web service or using some local loaded road data. We're going to go through a very quick process where we're going to actually use a web service. And you'll see right in this search for address button, the geocoding button right at the bottom of the screen here, on this window. I'm going to point to a file called Customers. It's a very simple little text file. I'm going to click Open. It is I believe it's a tab delimited file. We will find out. There are column names in the first row of my file. We do not have any loaded row data, so we're going to use our online search function and click OK. Now, hopefully, our web connection is working for us today, and there we go. What I did as part of that process is essentially add a lat long to each of my customers based on their address. Now, the exact match, as you can see, the precision is exact address match. In the real world, it's likely you will have some unmatched addresses or matched to a street, but not a specific address, or matched to a street. But as you can see, geocoding is a very, very simple, very powerful tool. I can, at this stage, create points in Global Mapper or simply export the results back to a file again. So my geocoding tool essentially allowing me to plot my addresses, put them on the map if necessary, or simply export them with those lat long values associated with them. So geocoding, as we saw in the search menu, very simple, very powerful tool. Let's take a quick look at. I'm going to load with vernal pools. They're seasonal and the state of Massachusetts have recognized that because you can see they've done a very extensive project in mapping their vernal pools, and you can see the point distribution throughout the state. What I want to show you using this data is the ability to create a density map. A density map essentially is a heat map that shows concentrations of points. So in this case, I'm just simply going to initiate this process to create a heat map indicating where the most important areas in Massachusetts are for vernal pools. I'm right-clicking on the layer that contains the points, and one of the options here is density. Now, hopefully, over the course of the scenarios we've gone through today, I've introduced you to some of these right-click options in the etc. Let's go ahead and check. The end result of that, slightly easier to turn off the points, is a density map showing where in the state there are highest concentration. At the bottom, the southern area indicated by the red areas, there's a higher concentration. Those of you familiar with Global Mapper may see some familiarity in this color scheme. This is essentially an elevation layer, but it's an elevation layer within which the variable is not actually a height, but in this case it's a level of clustering or a concentration. So we use the same shader functionality, but in this case, as you can see, creating a very, very interesting density map. So I'm going to save this workspace because in a few minutes when we wrap up, I'm going to bring this one up again to show you one final function. So just simply going to hit the save button. Workspace is now saved. I want to load up one more workspace. And this final workspace we're going to be working with is actually some elevation data. As I promised, we're going to show you many aspects of the software. Certainly it would not be a complete webinar if we didn't actually address the idea of working with 3D data. This particular layer that will eventually pop up is a LiDAR. There is an option to change that perspective that it's interesting to when I introduced this, very few people have actually encountered, and that's called walk mode. Right here on the toolbar of the 3D view, there's a button, it looks like a pair of binoculars, that changes your perspective and changes the way you interact with this 3D map. In walk at a defined height, and I can actually specify that height very specifically by going to the settings area of the 3D window and defining exactly how far above the ground level I want my perspective to be. Is simply triggered by clicking and holding with my left mouse button. Oh, I'm jumping over that ridge. So you can see it's a much more kind of realistic way of allowing you to see the terrain, to interact with the terrain, and to see any features that you have. I don't have any other data, obviously, but if I had some imagery or some vector features, some maybe extruded buildings, 3D buildings, I could walk around the buildings. I could see them in a much more realistic way. So that's an option in the 3D window. Then again, just in speaking with some of our users, that a lot of people have not actually encountered. One final thing within the 3D view, and that is actually an option in the config based on a request or a discussion I had with one of our users to represent or reflective surface. This is a matte surface right now. You can see there's no reflectivity, but we have an option under our shader option. I'm sorry, under our vertical options in the configuration dialog box to essentially re-reflect any direct light. Now I'm just going to pull this across to about the halfway point and click apply so you can see the results. What this does for my 3D view, it gives it almost a sheen or a metallic view, giving it a very interesting variation on the texture. Again, what you're seeing here is based on the light source defined by your light direction. You're seeing and helping you visualize the model. Again, in the configuration dialog box, it's the hill shading highlight from direct light option, and it's simply a slider bar. Scroll back and forward and adjust it to the level of reflection that you need. And one final thing before we wrap up. An array of layout options. I'm not going to talk about these specifically, but we can put scale on the map, we can put a legend on the map, we can put text, which would be a heading. One of the components which is not currently in this area, in this dialog box, which essentially layout tool as well is the ability for you to add a file at a fixed location, and it's initiated from the file menu. Now, what I would typically use this for is putting a piece of graphic art into my printed map. Use this for that. I'm going to choose, I thought I had a logo here. Let me actually go. And I will choose the Blue Marble logo. I want to define its dimensions as being about 20% of the width of my screen. I'm going to put it towards the bottom right side. Let's make it about an inch. Actually, it isn't appearing. It's probably behind the other files. Bear with me for 1 second. We'll turn all of the other layers off. Oops. Zoom to and we'll see if it appears. Oh, I must have defined the parameters wrong. But anyway, that function allows me to put an image file right on my screen, and it's at a fixed location. In other words, it does not move geographically. It moves relative to your screen alignment. I apologize that that didn't actually work. We have reached the top of the hour once again. There are many, many more functions that I would love to have a chance to share with you today. Hopefully I gave you an idea that there's a lot of hidden functions, a lot of hidden tools in Global Mapper. We talked about interface and general functions. A lot of digitizer tools are hidden in that right-click menu. We introduced some of the attribute management tools. Our analysis functions, there's a lot of stuff that's being added in there. Certainly we are in the process of releasing version 15.2 with enhanced analysis functionality, and in the 3D view. 3D view is something we're putting a lot of emphasis on as well. So again, my objective in today's webinar was to show you some tools that you may not have known, even those of you who had used Global Mapper for many years. Hopefully we achieved that today. Looks like we are out of time. Before we wrap up, we are close to finalizing the content for next month's webinar. You should see an announcement in the next couple of days. If you subscribe to our email service, you'll get an email. If you go to our website, you can get online there. We will specifically be talking next month about what's new in version 15.2. Again, that's being released as we speak, and we'll have a webinar to describe that.
Yeah, we actually already released it, and I want everybody to go online and check out our new website. We've got a new look and feel to our website as well. So.
Excellent. Heather actually did a lot of work in that regard. So the support guys in the background, hopefully they were able to answer your questions. Thanks for bringing those in. I know we addressed some of them during the presentation. If we didn't have a chance to answer your question, I apologize. Again, feel free to use the email address you see on your screen right now, GeoHelp, or go to the forum. The forum is a great way to post questions, browse through previous questions, etc. So it's a great resource. So thank you again. The recording of this webinar will be processed in the next couple of days and should be available for viewing online again. Before the end of the week, you can check on our website and you can share this with your colleagues or revisit some of those components that maybe we went through a little quickly at the end there. So,
Thanks, Sid.
Thank you, Heather, and thank you all for attending today.